January 17th, 1945. The sky hangs low, a heavy gray blanket over the frozen fields of the Ardennes. Mud churns under booted feet, thick and unyielding. German soldiers huddle in shallow foxholes, rifles clutched, faces pale beneath frost-bitten helmets. Every few seconds, the earth shakes with a roar that seems to come from the sky itself. Artillery shells tearing through the horizon, whistling, then detonating in thunderous blasts that shatter the air. Smoke curls and drifts, mingling with the fog, masking the landscape in a haze of chaos. Tracer lines crisscross the battlefield, red arcs of destruction, marking the relentless advance of invisible enemies. Men press against the dirt, teeth gritted, hearts pounding, the ground trembling beneath them. A single shell lands closer than before, splintering wood, scattering earth, and sending a soldier tumbling into the mud. No words are spoken. There is no time. Only the endless, thunderous rhythm of shells, a terrifying, inescapable symphony of war that grinds both body and spirit. And somewhere beyond the smoke, the seeds of a turning point are quietly taking root, ready to reshape everything these men thought they knew about survival and defeat. By late 1944, Europe was a continent stretched thin, its nations battered by years of relentless conflict. The Western Front had become a grim tapestry of fortified lines, shattered villages, and scorched forests. After the successful D-Day landings in June, Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches of Normandy, advancing through the hedgerows of France, each village a hard-won prize. Germany, though still formidable, was under immense pressure. Its forces were spread across multiple fronts: the Eastern Front against the Red Army, the Italian campaign, and the Western Front where the Allies' armored columns and airborne units threatened to cut through its heartland. The Wehrmacht's defensive strategy relied heavily on entrenched positions, artillery batteries, and coordinated counterattacks. Across the Ardennes and northern France, soldiers occupied forests, riverbanks, and villages, digging foxholes and laying mines. Supply lines were precarious, rationed, and under constant threat from Allied air attacks. Morale varied. Seasoned troops hardened by years of fighting contrasted sharply with younger recruits, many conscripted with little combat experience, facing the ever-present fear of artillery and air bombardment. Commanders relied on discipline and strict hierarchy to maintain order, yet whispers of doubt and fatigue were growing among the ranks. For the Allies, the focus was clear: break the German lines and accelerate the collapse of the Third Reich. Intelligence reports, aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted communications allowed planners to identify German positions with increasing accuracy. Artillery, once a supporting element, became the spearhead of this effort. Coordinated barges, using thousands of guns across hundreds of kilometers, could decimate fortified positions before infantry moved in. The Allies developed intricate firing schedules, integrating field artillery, naval bombardments, and airstrikes. Every shell launched was calculated to weaken the enemy's morale, disrupt communications, and prepare the battlefield for a rapid advance. In the Ardennes, this strategy took on a particular intensity. The region's dense forests and rolling hills had long been considered natural barriers, ideal for defensive operations. But the same terrain also amplified the terror of sustained artillery. Explosions echoed through the valleys, shaking trees and sending clouds of debris into the freezing air. Soldiers described it as a storm without end, a ceaseless percussion of thunder that left no moment of respite. Foxholes collapsed under near misses, supply routes were shredded by craters, and even the most seasoned troops felt the creeping dread that each shell could be their last. On the German side, commanders faced impossible choices. Reinforcements were limited, artillery ammunition dwindling, and communications often disrupted by shell fire. Reports from the front indicated that men were increasingly unable to hold positions under the continuous bombardment. In many cases, units were forced to abandon key positions to avoid annihilation. Yet, orders demanded that the lines be held at all costs, creating a tension between the soldiers' instinct for survival and the rigid expectations of the command structure. The human cost was mounting silently. Fatigue, fear, and the psychological strain of constant bombardment began to erode cohesion even before the enemy broke through. The civilian population, too, endured the creeping reach of the artillery war. Villages in the path of the advance became ghost towns, homes leveled, families displaced. Smoke from burning fields mingled with the fog of battle, adding to the sense of an endless, living nightmare. Local roads were torn to shreds, making evacuation and supply all the more perilous. For the men in the trenches, these sights reinforced a sense of isolation. They were soldiers trapped in a crucible of steel, mud, and fear, awaiting the inevitable next wave of shells that might obliterate their world in an instant. By the time January 1945 arrived, the stage was set for one of the most intense artillery campaigns of the war. Allied planners had amassed unprecedented firepower, while German forces braced themselves for relentless punishment. The forests and hills of the Ardennes, once a haven of defensive advantage, would soon transform into a landscape of terror. The echoing booms that had haunted the soldiers' nights were only a prelude to the overwhelming thunderstorm of shells that would define the coming days. In this crucible, human endurance, technological innovation, and tactical planning converged, setting the stage for an unrelenting test of survival and strategy that would leave an indelible mark on all who endured it. The soldiers in their foxholes could not yet see the scale of what was about to unfold. Yet, beneath the frozen earth and the smoke of distant fires, the machinery of war was already moving. Every decision, every calculation, every artillery piece primed for fire contributed to the coming storm, one that would test the very limits of courage and discipline on both sides of the front. By mid-January 1945, the Allies were preparing a series of coordinated offensives designed to shatter German defenses in the West. In the Ardennes, the infamous Battle of the Bulge had recently concluded, leaving both sides battered, exhausted, and acutely aware of the decisive role artillery could play. Allied commanders, having learned from the chaotic winter fighting, amassed unprecedented concentrations of guns and ammunition, determined to maintain pressure and prevent the Germans from regrouping. Field artillery, self-propelled guns, and massive howitzers were positioned across forests, hills, and valleys, their crews operating with meticulous precision under harsh winter conditions. Each unit knew its target, firing sequence, and timing. The result was a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction designed to crush both fortifications and morale. German forces, meanwhile, faced a stark reality. Supply lines were overstretched, reinforcements scarce, and communications hampered by the relentless pounding of artillery. Units huddled in their foxholes and bunkers, listening to the ground tremble beneath them. Reports filtered in from frontline troops. Entire defensive positions had been obliterated overnight, trenches filled with mud and debris. Officers struggling to maintain order as fear spread among the ranks. Winter conditions compounded the terror. Frozen ground made digging new positions nearly impossible, while deep snow hampered movement and slowed resupply. Soldiers relied on the scant protection of timbered shelters or foxholes barely deep enough to shield them from shrapnel, aware that any misstep could be fatal. The Allied artillery strategy was both numerical and psychological. Thousands of shells were fired daily, a constant presence that denied the Germans the comfort of silence or safety. Targets included artillery positions, command posts, supply depots, and roads, anything that could impede the Allied advance or allow German units to reorganize. Sophisticated techniques, such as creeping barges, rolling fire, and counter-battery operations ensured that German guns were suppressed before they could respond effectively. Even when shells missed their immediate target, the shockwaves and debris were enough to disrupt movement and erode morale. Soldiers described the landscape as unrecognizable, forests flattened, fields cratered, villages reduced to rubble. The terror was cumulative. There was no respite, only a continuous drumbeat of destruction that became a part of the soldiers' daily reality. German reactions were varied, but uniformly strained. Veteran officers attempted to reorganize shattered units, issuing orders to hold positions at all costs, but their voices often faltered against the backdrop of exploding shells. Young recruits, many experiencing their first major combat, froze under the bombardment or panicked, abandoning posts in desperate attempts to seek shelter. Commanders tried to reinforce morale through direct engagement, walking the trenches and encouraging troops. Yet even seasoned soldiers admitted to sleepless nights haunted by the thunder of artillery. Letters and diaries from the period reveal an undercurrent of fear, the dread of the next shell, the invisible threat that could strike at any moment, and the psychological toll of being constantly under fire. Terrain played a crucial role in amplifying the impact of artillery. The Ardennes, with its dense forests and undulating hills, created echoes that magnified every blast. Craters formed from near misses trapped men, destroyed equipment, and rerouted supply lines. Natural obstacles that might have aided defense instead amplified chaos, with exploding shells turning trees into projectiles and shrouding the landscape in smoke and splintered timber. Observation posts became critical yet perilous, as the slightest elevation exposed officers and artillery spotters to lethal fire. Every tactical decision was shadowed by the omnipresent artillery threat, forcing German commanders to weigh the costs of movement, counterattack, or withdrawal against the certainty of bombardment. Meanwhile, the Allies meticulously coordinated infantry and armored units with artillery barges, exploiting the terror and disorganization they caused. Tanks moved behind the rolling thunder of shells, infantry advanced under smoke and fire, and engineers cleared obstacles in the wake of devastation. The Germans, unable to predict the timing or intensity of these attacks, faced a relentless combination of firepower and maneuver that left little room for effective response. The psychological effect was as potent as the physical destruction. Exhaustion, panic, and the constant fear of annihilation undermined the will to resist. By the end of this preparatory phase, the stage was fully set for the relentless artillery campaigns that would dominate the Ardennes in the opening months of 1945. German forces braced themselves in their foxholes, ditches, and bunkers, aware that the coming days would test every ounce of endurance, courage, and discipline. Beyond the frozen trees and cratered fields, the machinery of war had reached a scale and intensity previously unseen, preparing to unleash a storm that would define the human and tactical dimensions of the conflict. Every decision, every shell fired, and every defensive maneuver converged toward a single, inevitable crescendo, the turning point where the thunderous artillery would no longer just harass, but dictate the fate of men and armies alike. The final line naturally sets up the next section, Angles, where we will examine the human, tactical, technological, leadership, and moral perspectives of the artillery campaign. The first angle to consider is human. For the German soldiers entrenched across the Ardennes, artillery was more than a weapon. It was an omnipresent force that assaulted both body and mind. Men described the sensation of the ground heaving beneath them, the air ripped by whistling shells, and the deafening cracks that followed each explosion. Sleep became nearly impossible, with nightmares blending seamlessly into the waking hours. In diaries and post-war testimonies, soldiers recalled the psychological toll. Hands trembling, hearts racing, the instinctive urge to flee or curl into the earth. Survival depended as much on mental resilience as on training. The relentless shelling created an environment where even minor injuries could become fatal, as evacuation and medical care were often impossible under continuous fire. The human cost was invisible to commanders at times, yet it dictated the pace of resistance and the cohesion of units under pressure. From a tactical perspective, artillery had evolved into a decisive instrument of battlefield control. Allied planners leveraged the weapon not simply to destroy, but to shape the battlefield itself. Pre-assault barges weakened German fortifications, cut off supply routes, and disrupted communications. Rolling barges, synchronized with infantry advances, allowed soldiers to move behind a moving curtain of fire that suppressed defensive positions before they could react. Counter-battery fire neutralized German artillery, denying them the ability to respond effectively. This tactical orchestration transformed artillery from mere bombardment into an integrated tool of maneuver warfare, with a coordination between gun crews, infantry, and armored units dictated the tempo and success of operations. Every shell served a dual purpose, inflicting damage and dictating enemy behavior. Technology underpinned this tactical advantage. By 1945, artillery had become increasingly sophisticated. Radar and sound-ranging devices allowed for precise targeting of enemy batteries, while forward observers equipped with binoculars and radios relayed coordinates in real time. Self-propelled guns added mobility, enabling crews to reposition quickly to avoid counterfire. Heavy howitzers, capable of firing shells weighing hundreds of pounds, could obliterate bunkers and entrenched positions that would have required days of infantry assault to neutralize. Munitions themselves had improved. High explosive, armor-piercing, and fragmentation rounds allowed for tailored destruction. These technological developments amplified the psychological impact on German troops, as they faced a weapon system that seemed to anticipate their every movement. The human and technological angles intertwined, shaping the leadership challenge on both sides. German officers struggled to maintain cohesion under conditions that rendered conventional command nearly impossible. Orders to hold positions were difficult to enforce when artillery shattered lines and morale. Some leaders attempted innovative countermeasures, dispersing units, constructing deeper shelters, or organizing night movements to evade shelling. Yet these measures often fell short against the sheer volume and precision of Allied fire. On the Allied side, leadership involved meticulous planning, timing, and the ability to coordinate multiple units across vast distances. Success depended on discipline, communication, and an understanding of how men, machines, and munitions could be synchronized to maximize effect. The moral angle cannot be ignored. The deliberate use of continuous artillery raised ethical questions about the nature of modern warfare. Soldiers were exposed to sustained bombardment, not only to destroy positions, but to erode the human will. The psychological strain inflicted by ceaseless shelling blurred the lines between tactical necessity and human suffering. Contemporary accounts reveal soldiers grappling with fear, guilt, and the ethical dilemmas of commanding or participating in campaigns that subjected both combatants and civilians to unprecedented levels of destruction. Even within the Wehrmacht, officers recognized that the relentless pressure applied by the Allies was not merely physical but existential, a test of endurance designed to break both bodies and spirits. These first angles, human, tactical, technological, and leadership, intersected in a theater defined by both innovation and terror. Soldiers faced the tangible threat of death and injury, while commanders contended with the unpredictable responses of men under fire. Technology multiplied the destructive potential of artillery, creating a battlefield where human endurance was tested to its limits. The psychological dimension became as critical as the physical, shaping decisions and outcomes in ways that few previous conflicts had demanded. As the thunder of shells continued without pause, each moment reinforced a central truth. Artillery was no longer merely a weapon, but a force capable of determining the fate of entire divisions. The conditions, the innovations, and the relentless pressure converged to prepare the stage for the next layer of analysis. Examining enemy responses, the failures of German countermeasures, and the moral and leadership decisions that would define the ultimate turning point in the artillery campaign. Continuing with the leadership angle, the German command faced an unprecedented dilemma. Orders demanded steadfast defense, yet the reality on the ground was brutal. Continuous artillery bombardment disrupted communications, shredded trenches, and fractured unit cohesion. Senior officers, from battalion commanders to division leaders, were forced to adapt in real time. They implemented dispersal tactics, moving troops into secondary lines, reinforcing foxholes with timber and sandbags, and attempting counter-battery fire with limited resources. But coordination was tenuous at best. Subordinate officers often had to make split-second decisions in isolation, balancing obedience to orders with the instinct to preserve their men. For many commanders, the weight of responsibility was crushing. Diaries and post-war memoirs reflect sleepless nights, anxiety over losing entire units, and the moral burden of sending men into near-certain peril. From the enemy angle, German artillery units attempted to respond, but the scale and precision of Allied fire rendered most efforts ineffective. Counter-battery operations, designed to locate and neutralize Allied guns, were hampered by poor visibility, frozen terrain, and constant shelling. Radar and aerial reconnaissance provided the Allies with superior targeting intelligence, often allowing them to strike German positions before they could fire. Even when German batteries managed to return fire, they were often isolated and rapidly silenced. Infantry units found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, unable to advance under Allied barges, yet constantly under threat from their own disrupted lines. The relentless pressure created operational paralysis, forcing German forces into defensive postures that limited tactical flexibility and exposed them to further attrition. The moral dimension of the campaign further complicated the German response. Soldiers and officers grappled with the ethical implications of their actions under bombardment, as well as the consequences of decisions made under duress. Civilians were not spared. Villages became collateral damage, and retreating populations were exposed to both shelling and freezing winter conditions. Orders to hold positions at all costs conflicted with the instinct for survival and the responsibility to protect non-combatants. German leaders, aware of the growing humanitarian toll, faced the grim reality that adherence to doctrine often meant accepting mass suffering. Meanwhile, Allied commanders understood the psychological impact of their artillery strategy, yet framed it as a necessary measure to accelerate the end of the war. The calculated infliction of terror raised questions about the boundaries of morality in modern warfare, highlighting the human cost of strategic decisions. Technology and innovation continued to define the battlefield experience. Allied advances in artillery coordination, linking observation posts, forward controllers, and mass guns, allowed for near-constant, precise fire. Shell types were adapted for specific objectives. High-explosive rounds to destroy bunkers, fragmentation shells to suppress infantry, and smoke rounds to obscure observation. German troops, even when equipped with their own artillery, were increasingly outmatched by superior range, accuracy, and coordination. This technological imbalance amplified the effects on morale, creating a sense of inevitability in the Allied advance. Soldiers wrote of the disorienting rhythm of bombardment, where the landscape itself seemed alive with deadly intent, leaving little room for strategy or hope. The human consequences intersected with tactical and technological realities to create a battlefield defined by fear, attrition, and desperation. Units were forced into defensive formations that prioritized survival over maneuver, while leadership decisions were constrained by shattered communications and the need to minimize casualties. Soldiers' mental endurance became as critical as physical strength. Those who survived the bombardments often described a sense of numbness, as the mind adapted to a constant state of alert and dread. Commanders, too, were shaped by the relentless pressure, their choices influenced not only by operational necessity, but by the psychological fragility of their men. Ultimately, these angles converge to illustrate the totalizing effect of continuous artillery on the German forces. The campaign was not merely a contest of firepower. It was a multidimensional assault on human resilience, command capability, and strategic flexibility. By combining precision technology, tactical coordination, and psychological pressure, the Allies created conditions in which traditional German responses were insufficient. The soldiers in their foxholes endured a punishment that tested every aspect of warfare: physical, mental, and ethical. The stage was now set for the decisive moment, the climax, where relentless artillery would no longer simply harass or demoralize, but actively dictate the outcome of battles and the fate of entire units. January 22nd, 1945. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the Ardennes, muffling the distant rumble that would soon become unbearable. Allied commanders had synchronized an immense artillery operation designed to precede a coordinated infantry and armored advance. Thousands of guns, from field howitzers to self-propelled artillery, prepared to open fire across a 50-kilometer front. Observation posts had reported every German trench, battery, and fortified village with near-perfect accuracy. The stage was set, a premeditated storm calculated to crush the German defensive line before the first Allied boots crossed it. At 0600 hours, the first salvo struck. The ground quivered as shells landed in rapid succession, exploding with earth-shattering force. Trees splintered and fell like dominoes, sending shards into frozen soil and foxholes. German soldiers tried to take cover, but the sheer volume of fire rendered traditional defenses nearly useless. Trenches collapsed, and ammunition depots detonated under the unrelenting pressure. Within the first hour, entire defensive positions were neutralized. Men pressed into the mud, faces pale, teeth gritted against the shock waves that seemed to penetrate bone. Panic rippled through the ranks, yet disciplined officers attempted to rally their men, shouting orders over the cacophony of destruction. The artillery was not random. It was methodically choreographed. Creeping barges advanced at a precise rate of 100 meters every 3 minutes, a moving wall of destruction that forced German defenders to remain buried or face annihilation. Counter-battery operations identified active German guns and systematically eliminated them, preventing any meaningful retaliation. Forward observers relayed real-time coordinates to battery crews, adjusting fire with near-perfect precision. Even experienced soldiers found it impossible to anticipate the next strike, and a constant unpredictability added to the psychological torment. Every blast reinforced the perception that the battlefield had become a living entity, controlled entirely by the unseen hand of Allied planners. As the day progressed, the bombardment intensified. Villages that had once served as defensive hubs were reduced to rubble. Roads were torn to pieces, complicating the movement of German reinforcements and supplies. Infantry units attempting to regroup were caught in the crossfire or buried by debris from near-miss explosions. Shells detonated with terrifying proximity, sending earth and shrapnel into the air and forcing men to abandon positions they had held for days. The relentless rhythm of artillery was nearly continuous. There was no moment of silence, no opportunity to recover. Communications lines, both wired and wireless, were disrupted, leaving commanders unable to coordinate counterattacks or call in reinforcements. In some sectors, German units attempted to mount a response. Mortar teams fired sporadic rounds at advancing positions, and a few artillery crews managed to return fire. But these efforts were largely symbolic, quickly suppressed by the overwhelming volume and precision of Allied barges. Tank units, when deployed, found themselves advancing behind rolling curtains of smoke and artillery fire that obscured enemy positions, yet left them exposed to shell fragments and debris. The battlefield had become a choreographed maze of death, where survival depended on timing, discipline, and often sheer luck. By midday, the human and material toll was staggering. Casualties mounted as men were crushed, buried, or thrown into the mud by explosions. Trenches and bunkers were obliterated, leaving few options for cover. Officers attempted to restore order, moving between shattered positions and issuing commands that were difficult to hear over the thunder of shells. Yet even the most resilient units began to falter. Panic became contagious, and some soldiers fled, abandoning positions and leaving gaps that could not be reinforced. The relentless pressure had begun to dictate the flow of the battle. The German defense was no longer a matter of tactical decision, but a reaction to an overwhelming force that left little room for maneuver. As afternoon approached, the intensity of fire reached its peak. Artillery crews maintained an almost industrial pace, firing salvo after salvo with mechanical precision. The cumulative effect was both physical and psychological. Soldiers described feeling the ground roll beneath them, as if the earth itself had become a weapon. Explosions tore through frozen forests, flattened villages, and created enormous craters in open fields. For the German defenders, it was impossible to distinguish between near misses and direct hits, intensifying fear and confusion. In this crucible, leadership, training, and experience were tested to their limits. The battlefield had become an arena where artillery alone dictated outcomes, reshaping the landscape and the fates of those caught within it. By evening, the first objectives of the Allied operation had been secured, largely due to the unrelenting artillery fire. German defensive lines had been fractured, leaving gaps that infantry and armored units could exploit. Commanders on both sides understood that the nature of warfare had shifted. Artillery was no longer a supporting weapon, but the dominant force determining both movement and survival. The stage was now set for the next phase of the climax, where German forces would face the full brunt of coordinated Allied attacks, and the consequences of unceasing bombardment would become irreversible. As night fell on January 22nd, 1945, the Ardennes battlefield remained an unbroken roar of artillery fire. German positions, already weakened by the morning and afternoon barges, began to collapse entirely under the relentless pressure. Commanders struggled to maintain a coherent line, issuing orders through the chaos, but disrupted communications and shattered trenches rendered coordination nearly impossible. Soldiers attempted to dig in, reinforcing shelters with timber, mud, or snow, but shells continuously splintered wood, churned earth, and tore open foxholes. Exhaustion weighed heavily. Men could barely lift their rifles, and fear became a constant companion, gnawing at resolve as much as the bitter cold. The Allied advance followed meticulously behind the rolling artillery. Infantry moved cautiously through snow-covered craters, guided by tracer fire and the occasional flash of armored units. Every position abandoned or destroyed by shells opened a pathway for tanks and engineers to advance, clearing obstacles under cover of suppressive fire. German troops, caught between the terror of bombardment and advancing enemy forces, attempted sporadic counterattacks, but disorganization and fear often made these efforts futile. Entire units fell back under pressure, leaving critical gaps along the defensive lines. In some sectors, the retreat became chaotic, men fleeing into forests or across frozen fields to escape the unyielding thunder of shells. The psychological impact intensified as explosions continued into the night. Soldiers reported an almost unnatural rhythm, a cadence of destruction that blurred minutes into hours. Some described feeling the earth itself pulse beneath them, each shell a wave of fear and panic washing over the line. Officers, striving to rally their men, risked exposure in traversing cratered terrain, often only to find soldiers incapacitated by shock, mud, or injuries. Mortar teams, machine gun positions, and remaining artillery pieces were systematically destroyed, leaving few options for organized resistance. The battlefield was a theater dominated by artillery, a force that dictated both space and tempo, leaving German troops little choice but to react. Meanwhile, Allied artillery commanders maintained precise timing and coordination. Batteries were repositioned to cover retreating positions, preventing German forces from regrouping. Observation posts relayed real-time corrections, and counter-battery fire eliminated active German guns. Ammunition supply lines were efficient and protected, ensuring that barges could continue without interruption. Every salvo further fractured the enemy's cohesion, ensuring that advances by infantry and armor met minimal organized resistance. By nightfall, the combination of continuous bombardment and coordinated assaults had created a landscape in which the German defense was effectively paralyzed. In some areas, retreating German units attempted desperate measures, withdrawing to secondary lines, forming ad hoc defensive positions, or conducting night movements to evade observation and fire. Yet, even these efforts were hampered by the terrain, disrupted communications, and the unrelenting artillery. Craters, debris, and frozen mud obstructed movement, while artillery fire remained a constant threat. Commanders realized that the window for effective resistance was closing rapidly. The battle was being dictated entirely by the thunderous rhythm of Allied guns. Survival often depended on improvisation and sheer luck rather than strategy or skill. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Shellfire had destroyed positions, mangled equipment, and created massive craters across the front. Medics worked frantically, often under fire, trying to stabilize the wounded, while many men remained trapped in collapsed trenches or buried beneath debris. Morale plummeted as the reality of unceasing bombardment became undeniable. Letters, diaries, and later testimonies describe a pervasive sense of inevitability. The soldiers understood that no position could withstand such concentrated fire indefinitely. Fear, exhaustion, and confusion converged to erode discipline, leaving retreat, surrender, or improvised defense as the only options. By the early hours of January 23rd, the scale of devastation became apparent. German defensive lines had been fractured and breached. Infantry and armored units advanced into previously defended sectors with minimal opposition. The artillery had achieved its intended effect: destruction of fortifications, suppression of enemy response, and psychological domination of troops on the ground. Commanders on both sides recognized a fundamental truth. The outcome of this phase of battle was no longer determined by small unit tactics or individual heroism, but by the relentless, coordinated application of firepower. The night's events marked a turning point. Continuous artillery had transformed the battlefield, dictating movement, shaping decisions, and leaving German forces with diminishing options. What began as a coordinated preparation had escalated into a near-total collapse of defensive cohesion. The thunder of shells had become the primary instrument of victory, leaving an indelible mark on both the landscape and the men who endured it. The aftermath of this bombardment would redefine operational planning, reveal the human cost of relentless firepower, and shape the final stages of the conflict in the Western Front. The morning after the relentless artillery barges, the Ardennes bore the unmistakable scars of devastation. Trenches were collapsed, trees splintered, and entire villages reduced to rubble. The earth itself seemed scarred by craters, each one a grim reminder of the unyielding thunder that had pounded the German defenses without pause. Survivors moved cautiously through the shattered terrain, their faces etched with fatigue, fear, and disbelief. The relentless bombardment had not only destroyed positions, but fractured the cohesion of entire units. German officers attempted to rally scattered troops, but the scope of destruction rendered many efforts futile. Casualty reports were sobering. Thousands of men had been killed, wounded, or rendered combat ineffective. Entire battalions were decimated, leaving gaps in defensive lines that could not be easily filled. Injured soldiers were trapped under collapsed trenches or buried beneath debris, with medics struggling to reach them under the intermittent shelling that still peppered some sectors. Equipment losses were equally severe. Artillery pieces, machine guns, and supply caches were destroyed, leaving German forces unable to respond effectively. Even the most veteran units were pushed to the brink, their numbers thinned and their morale shattered. The strategic consequences were immediate. German defensive lines were breached across multiple sectors, creating pathways for Allied infantry and armored units to advance with minimal resistance. The coordination of artillery with ground operations had achieved its intended effect, weakening the enemy's ability to resist and shaping the battlefield in favor of the attackers. Commanders on the Allied side assessed the results with precision. Maps were updated, positions marked, and follow-up attacks planned. The combined effect of destruction, demoralization, and disrupted communications ensured that the German forces were now on the defensive, struggling to reorganize under conditions of overwhelming firepower. Psychologically, the impact on German troops was profound. Survivors described feelings of helplessness, terror, and exhaustion. The constant noise, ground tremors, and unpredictability of shellfire had eroded confidence and discipline. Even those who remained uninjured found themselves physically and mentally drained, questioning their ability to hold positions or mount counterattacks. Diaries and post-war testimonies reveal a recurring theme: the sense that survival was largely a matter of chance. Soldiers recounted hearing shells that never seemed to stop, feeling trapped beneath an invisible, omnipresent force that dictated every movement and decision. Civilians who had remained in the path of the bombardment faced similar devastation. Villages were leveled, homes destroyed, and families displaced. Roads and bridges were impassable, complicating evacuation efforts and limiting access to food, water, and medical supplies. The psychological toll extended beyond the battlefield, as non-combatants grappled with the sudden collapse of their communities and the relentless destruction surrounding them. For German officers, the challenge was not only to manage soldiers, but also to mitigate civilian suffering, often with limited resources and under constant threat. Even the terrain itself had been transformed. Craters, shattered forests, and destroyed infrastructure hindered movement, supply lines, and the establishment of new defensive positions. German engineers worked under extreme pressure to repair roads, rebuild fortifications, and restore artillery positions. Yet the scale of destruction often made these efforts futile. Each new repair or reinforcement was vulnerable to renewed barges, creating a cycle of destruction and reconstruction that taxed both manpower and morale. In effect, The landscape had become a silent but formidable ally of the attackers, shaping the battlefield through the imprint of devastation left by continuous artillery. By the end of this phase, the combined human, material, and psychological toll was undeniable. German units were fragmented, morale was diminished, and the ability to mount organized resistance had been severely compromised. Allied forces, having exploited artillery as both a destructive and psychological weapon, had secured a decisive operational advantage. The battlefield was a testament to the effectiveness of relentless, coordinated firepower, illustrating both the tactical innovation and the human cost of modern warfare. In the days following the bombardment, the broader consequences of the artillery campaign became clear. German forces, already stretched thin, faced an operational collapse across multiple sectors. Defensive cohesion had been shattered, leaving surviving units disorganized and reactive. Attempts to regroup were hampered by destroyed communications, impassable roads, and ongoing harassment for follow-up artillery and airstrikes. Commanders reported that the psychological toll was as debilitating as the physical losses. Men were demoralized, exhausted, and increasingly fearful of holding positions under continued fire. In several instances, units abandoned objectives entirely, retreating into the forested terrain of the Ardennes, where survival became the primary concern. The Allies, meanwhile, consolidated their gains. The successful use of massed artillery allowed infantry and armored divisions to advance with minimal resistance, securing key roads, villages, and supply routes. Tactical planning emphasized coordination, with artillery shaping the battlefield in real time and enabling rapid exploitation of gaps in the German lines. Reports from Allied command highlighted the effectiveness of sustained barges, noting both the destruction inflicted and the psychological dislocation experienced by enemy troops. For the first time in the Ardennes campaign, artillery was acknowledged not merely as a supporting tool, but as a central instrument of operational strategy, capable of dictating both tempo and outcome. Strategically, the aftermath reshaped the operational landscape. German high command recognized that their ability to mount counteroffensives in the region had been critically impaired. Resources were diverted from other fronts in a desperate attempt to reinforce positions and stabilize morale, further straining an already overstretched military apparatus. The cumulative effect of attrition, disrupted supply lines, and continuous bombardment undermined the Wehrmacht's operational flexibility, giving the Allies a decisive advantage in subsequent engagements. In essence, the artillery campaign had transformed localized tactical gains into a broader strategic impact, accelerating the collapse of German resistance in the West. The human and psychological toll extended beyond immediate combat. German soldiers described pervasive exhaustion, fear, and a sense of inevitability, an understanding that no defensive measure could withstand the continuous thunder of shells. Diaries and post-war accounts reveal recurring nightmares, hallucinations, and persistent anxiety long after the bombardments ended. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and morale, aware that even minor acts of insubordination or panic could cascade into larger failures. The mental strain was compounded by the devastation of the surrounding landscape. Familiar villages leveled, forests flattened, and infrastructure destroyed. For both combatants and civilians, the psychological imprint of the bombardment lingered, shaping perceptions of war and survival. Civilians who remained in the Ardennes faced a parallel crisis. Homes were destroyed, food and water scarce, and evacuation routes obstructed. Many endured freezing conditions without shelter, while others witnessed the destruction of towns and villages that had stood for centuries. The bombardment had not only erased physical structures, but disrupted community networks and imposed a lasting sense of vulnerability. German officers and civilians alike were forced to reckon with the ethical and humanitarian consequences of warfare on this scale, where strategic necessity collided with human suffering. Material consequences were equally profound. Artillery had leveled fortifications, destroyed vehicles and supply depots, and created a cratered landscape that hampered movement and reconstruction. Engineers labored to clear roads and rebuild positions, but the scale of destruction made comprehensive recovery nearly impossible in the short term. Each new artillery preparation or defensive measure required extraordinary effort and offered limited protection, illustrating the enduring dominance of firepower over conventional defensive tactics. The battlefield itself became both a symbol and an instrument of the campaign's effectiveness. In retrospect, the aftermath of the relentless artillery campaign highlighted several enduring lessons. First, sustained, coordinated bombardment could achieve decisive results beyond the capabilities of traditional infantry or armor alone. Second, psychological impact was as significant as physical destruction, shaping behavior, morale, and operational outcomes. Third, terrain, logistics, and command structure played critical roles in determining the effectiveness of both attack and defense. Together, these factors illustrated a shift in modern warfare. Victory increasingly depended on the integration of technology, planning, and human endurance under extreme pressure. As the rubble settled and survivors emerged from foxholes and forests, the reality of the campaign's consequences was undeniable. German forces were fractured, morale diminished, and strategic flexibility severely constrained. Allied units, having harnessed the full potential of artillery, prepared for the next phase of operations. The battlefield bore silent testimony to the destructive power of fire and planning, leaving both men and landscape irrevocably altered. From this crucible of fire, the final reflection emerges. The enduring legacy of relentless artillery would shape not only immediate outcomes, but the broader understanding of warfare, human resilience, and the balance between technology and courage. The thunder of artillery that shook the Ardennes in January 1945 left more than shattered trenches and splintered villages. It left an indelible mark on the men who endured it, the commanders who orchestrated it, and the landscape that bore witness. For German soldiers, the campaign was a test of endurance and resolve, a brutal reminder of the limits of human resilience in the face of unrelenting force. Even the most disciplined units found themselves at the mercy of a technology and strategy that could dictate life or death with precision and unyielding regularity. For the Allies, the success of coordinated artillery demonstrated the evolution of modern warfare. Firepower had become not just a supporting tool, but a decisive instrument capable of shaping the battlefield, dictating the pace of engagements, and undermining both morale and material capability. The campaign highlighted the synergy between planning, observation, and technological innovation, showing that victory was as much about foresight and orchestration as it was about courage on the front lines. Yet, amid the operational triumph, there was an undeniable human cost. Civilians and soldiers alike faced the psychological weight of constant bombardment, a terror that left lasting scars. Letters, diaries, and post-war recollections testify to a collective endurance tested beyond imagination. It was a stark reminder that in the machinery of war, human lives remain both the currency and the consequence. The Ardennes artillery campaign stands as a testament to the dual nature of warfare, one of immense innovation and tactical brilliance, and one of profound human suffering. It reshaped both strategy and understanding, forcing commanders to recognize the interplay between firepower, terrain, and human psychology. Above all, it demonstrated that warfare had entered a new era, one in which thunderous, coordinated artillery could decide the fate of armies, cities, and history itself. As the echoes of shells faded and snow settled over the cratered landscape, a lesson remained clear. Technology and strategy may determine the outcome, but the human spirit, tested, strained, and often broken, remains at the center of every conflict. In this convergence of force and endurance, the story of the Ardennes reminds us that history is written not only in victories and losses, but in the courage, fear, and resilience of those who live through it.